Imagine the shock of a French explorer hearing a Basque phrase, meaning, "the priests are better," shouted by an indigenous person on the distant shores of Newfoundland. According to one account, when Jacques Cartier landed in 1534, some native people greeted him with words they had learned from earlier European visitors. Not only that, they ended up telling him of red-haired men from the ocean who arrived generations prior. This intriguing anecdote hints at a tantalizing possibility. Intrepid Basque mariners from Europe's Iberian Peninsula may have quietly sailed to the New World before Christopher Columbus. It's a theory that paints a picture of secret voyages across the Atlantic, well before 1492, by a seafaring people famous for their skill and their discretion. The Basques, an insular European people straddling what is now northern Spain and southwestern France, have a long history as master mariners. By the Middle Ages, Basque sailors were renowned whalers and fishermen, ranging far beyond their home in the Bay of Biscay. Their ships hunted whales along the European coasts and later ventured into the North Atlantic in pursuit of cod and more whale pods. In fact, Basques pioneered commercial whaling as early as the 13th century and became experts in preserving fish with salt, establishing a thriving trade in salted cod by 1000 AD. This maritime expertise set the stage for the idea that Basque sailors might have reached North America on their own initiative. According to the Basque before Columbus theory, these fishermen had both the means and motive to sail across the Atlantic well before Columbus. The motive was codfish, and lots of it. In the 1400s, fish was a dietary staple in Europe, and sources of cod were like gold mines. Church and cultural practices amongst Catholic Europeans dictated the consumption of fish on many days throughout the year. Further, fish was a relatively cheap and healthy source of protein in a time when terrestrial forms of meat weren't generally consumed daily by most people. The Basques, along with other Atlantic seafarers, were feeling the pinch as traditional fishing grounds became either overfished or restricted by competition. For instance, the Hanseatic League had monopolized Iceland's cod trade in the 1470s, effectively locking out Basque sailors. The idea goes that Basque crews, faced with dwindling catches at home, pushed ever westward in search of new, rich fishing grounds. Under this theory, they found them in the waters of Newfoundland and Labrador. Crucially, they supposedly kept this discovery secret to protect their competitive advantage. In essence, they found the greatest fishing hole in the world, and they weren't about to tell the world about what exactly they found. After all, this cod fishery would have been the richest source of fish ever discovered by Europeans up until that point. It's a compelling narrative. Basque mariners slipping silently across the ocean, quietly exploiting the New World's bounty, and saying nothing to rival kingdoms. Indeed, Basques were known for keeping their cards close. Their unique language, Euskera, isolated them culturally, and historically, they haven't been chatty with outsiders. In this theory, the Basques' famed discretion served them well. They salted their cod on hidden coasts and rendered whale oil in secluded coves, all out of sight of the competition, including the Portuguese, the English, and the French. Proponents of the Basque pre-Columbian theory point to several intriguing clues, though none is conclusive. These pieces of the puzzle suggest that Basques could have made it to America before 1492, even if definitive proof remains elusive. English customs records indicate that Basque traders delivered unusually large shipments of beaver pelts to England between 1380 and 1433. What's odd is that by the 14th century, beavers were nearing extinction in the areas of Europe that the Basques had access to. Yet despite this, the Basques were importing bundles of pelts, rolled in the distinctive style of eastern Canada's indigenous peoples. Some historians have speculated that these pelts came from the New World, having been obtained as a result of trading with the native population of eastern Canada. If true, it implies Basque contact with North America a full century before Columbus. This theory is speculative, but it's exactly the kind of subtle footprint secretive fishermen might leave. Notably, this theory seems to me to be relatively easy to either prove or disprove. If we can find and test beaver-based objects from prior to 1492 and prove those were made of American beavers, this would, in essence, prove the Basque theory. To my knowledge, this hasn't been done, and I don't believe it's even been proposed. But if you know otherwise, let me know in the comments below. The Basques weren't the only ones seeking new fisheries westward. The Portuguese and English merchants were sniffing around too in the 15th century. Portuguese records speak of a land of codfish west of the Azores region in 1473. The aggressive policies of the Hanseatic League with respect to codfish off Iceland didn't just hit Basque fishermen. English adventurers from Bristol, cut off from Iceland's cod, funded voyages in the 1480s to find cod to the west of Ireland, and are believed to have returned with suspiciously abundant catches. Under this theory, both the Portuguese and the English suspected the Basques of finding cod far to the west, and attempted to find these sources themselves. Perhaps the most colorful evidence of early Basque presence is linguistic. By the early 16th century, when French and English explorers began formally charting eastern Canada, they encountered signs that Basques had preceded them. Not only did Jacques Cartier perhaps hear a Basque greeting from natives in 1534, but it's documented that a Basque indigenous pidgin language developed for trade soon thereafter. This Algonquian Basque pidgin allowed native groups and Basque whalers to communicate for commerce. It contains Basque loanwords for items like iron and bread, indicating significant contact. Additionally, Basque words crept into the languages of Atlantic Canada's peoples, and indigenous words entered Basque vocabularies. For instance, in the Mi'kmaq language, traditional indigenous shoes are called mocon, while Western-style shoes are called zapatak, which they received through Basque influence. All of this, however, dates from the 1500s, after Columbus. So at best it shows Basques were among the earliest post-Columbian visitors. However, it's not entirely clear if they were there before, especially since the entire timeline regarding the Basque arrival in the New World is quite murky. All these clues build a circumstantial case that Basques could have reached America first and kept it quiet. The scenario is entirely plausible. The Basques had ocean-going ships, expertise in long-distance navigation, and economic incentive to find new fisheries. Unlike glory-seeking explorers, fishermen had no reason to plant flags or write memoirs. Their fortune lay in nobody else knowing where they got those fabulous fish and whale oils. It's a romantic picture of humble fishermen outwitting captains sailing under the authority of kings. But before we get carried away, we should look at what we know the Basques actually did in the New World, and how that lines up with, or contradicts, the pre-Columbian theory. What is beyond doubt is that the Basques were among the first Europeans to exploit North America after Columbus. In the decades following 1492, they appear on the historical stage of the New World in a big way, so much so that it sometimes surprised other explorers. In 1497, just 5 years after Columbus's maiden voyage, the Italian John Cabot, sailing for England, reached Newfoundland. He discovered numerous Basque fishing vessels harvesting cod, having done so under the radar until this meeting. At the time, of course, Cabot had no incentive to ask these Basque fishermen how long they had been there. He was, after all, commissioned to make discoveries in the New World, and finding other Europeans in an area he quote-unquote discovered for Europe wasn't a good look. Further, when Jacques Cartier discovered the Gulf of St. Lawrence for Europeans in 1535, he noted that Basque whalers were already there in droves. In other words, the Basques wasted no time in capitalizing on the New World once the age of exploration began, and they weren't sharing their secrets. Throughout the 1500s, Basque mariners effectively turned coastal Newfoundland, Labrador, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence into their seasonal domain. Spanish and French Basque companies ran a seasonal transatlantic commute. Every summer, thousands of Basque fishermen and whalers crossed the ocean to North America, and by winter they sailed back with ships laden with salted cod and barrels of whale oil. This was arguably the first large-scale industry in North America, predating any permanent European settlement. Further, archaeological evidence has indicated significant presence of whaling stations in eastern Canada in the 16th century. Despite the enticing theory and circumstantial hints, the modern historical consensus is that there is no solid proof the Basques reached the Americas before Columbus. Mainstream scholars categorize the Basque discovery idea as an interesting but unproven hypothesis. No Basque maps have been found that predate 1492 that definitively show the New World in any way. That isn't to say that they didn't exist in some form at some time, but they don't exist at present, weakening this theory. Further, decades of digs in Atlantic Canada have uncovered Basque camps and shipwrecks from the 16th century, but nothing that can be dated to the 1400s. All the Basque sites reliably date from after 1500, which poses an evidentiary problem for the theory. Now, that isn't to say that they weren't there prior to 1500, since we know that they were there by at least 1497. However, the hard physical evidence hasn't yet been found, especially for anything pre-Columbian. Notably, for Columbus's 1492 voyage, he used many Basque crew members, given that they were known to be some of the finest sailors in Europe. Scholars point out that this transatlantic experience could have meant that Basque sailors soon after launched their own fishing expeditions. In light of these points, historians conclude that the Basque pre-Columbian voyage remains unproven. It's certainly possible some Basque ships made it to the New World, but as yet, that definitive proof has never been found. Thus, the modern consensus for the time being is that the Basques reached North America very soon after Columbus, but likely not before him. And ultimately, even if it is discovered that the Basques were in America earlier than thought, this doesn't meaningfully rewrite history. It would likely be considered very similar to the Norse settlement, in that it would be an interesting footnote or precursor to the mass settlement of the New World that would follow Columbus. Imagine Edinburgh Castle on a cold November evening in 1440. Inside the Great Hall, a lavish banquet is underway. 10-year-old King James II sits at the head of the table, flanked by two teenage guests, the Douglas brothers, heirs of Scotland's most powerful noble family. Laughter and music fill the stone chamber until a servant presents a grisly centerpiece, the severed head of a black bull. Before the night is over, both Douglas heirs are beheaded in the castle yard, victims of a sensational act of betrayal that became known to history as the Black Dinner. It's a scene so dramatic and cruel that it sounds like fiction, yet it is all too real. Indeed, this medieval Scottish atrocity even helped inspire the infamous Red Wedding scene in Game of Thrones. To understand why two noble youths were brutally slain at a royal dinner, we must set the stage in mid-15th century Scotland, a time of political turmoil and power struggles. 3 years earlier, in 1437, Scotland's King James I had been assassinated, leaving his son James II to inherit the throne at the tender age of 6. With a child king, the country fell under regency, and various factions of nobles vied for control of the government. One of the most formidable figures was Archibald Douglas, 5th Earl of Douglas, the head of the mighty Black Douglas dynasty. Archibald was not only the kingdom's wealthiest magnate, but was even next in line to the throne, after little James II, thanks to intermarriages between the Douglases and the royal Stuart line. His influence was so great that he effectively served as regent for the boy king until Archibald's sudden death from illness in 1439. Archibald Douglas's demise unleashed a fierce struggle for power. On one side was the widowed Queen Mother, Joan Beaufort, determined to protect her son's interests. On the other side were ambitious noblemen like Sir William Crichton, the Lord Chancellor of Scotland, and Sir Alexander Livingston of Callander. These two men controlled key strongholds in Scotland and significant estates. Caught in the middle was the Douglas clan itself. Archibald's title and vast estates, virtually a principality within Scotland, passed to his teenage son William, the 6th Earl of Douglas, who was about 15 or 16 when he inherited in 1439. This youth suddenly became the most powerful noble in Scotland, at least on paper. But his very prominence made him a potential threat in the eyes of Crichton and Livingston. The two regents had no intention of letting the Douglas power overshadow their own grip on the kingdom. In fact, the Douglas family's influence was so extensive that many considered it a direct threat, not just to rival nobles, but even to the crown's authority. Through 1439 and 1440, the tension mounted significantly, and Crichton and Livingston jockeyed for dominance. They even went so far as to seize the young King James in a bid to control royal legitimacy. In essence, they agreed to keep him under their direct control, and most importantly, control access to who he was able to see and interact with. This not only allowed them to issue edicts in the king's name, but also raised the likelihood that Crichton and Livingston would remain close advisors of the king into his majority. Basically, they wanted to make themselves indispensable to King James in his minority, so that they would continue to influence him throughout his much longer majority. At the same time, they sought ways to neutralize the Douglas factor. The teenage Earl of Douglas, inexperienced, and next in succession to the throne after James II, was an obvious wild card in the political equation. Some sources suggest that by late 1440, the king's keepers had decided that the Douglas heir needed to be eliminated to secure their own power. Thus was born the diabolical plot that culminated in the Black Dinner. In November 1440, under the guise of reconciliation and friendship, William Douglas and his younger brother David received a royal invitation. They were asked to come to Edinburgh Castle to dine with King James II, who was by then 10 years old. The invitation likely seemed safe enough. After all, dining with the king implied royal hospitality and protection. The Douglas boys arrived accompanied by their advisor, Sir Malcolm Fleming, and perhaps a small retinue, expecting an evening of feasting and diplomacy. Unbeknownst to them, their hosts had other plans. The banquet began ordinarily, with tables laden and music playing. Accounts vary on the details, but legend has it that as the meal progressed, a dramatic and chilling signal was given. A covered platter was brought forth and placed before the Douglas brothers. When the lid was lifted, it revealed the head of a black bull, a dire omen that, in medieval Scotland, signified death. In that instant, the atmosphere flipped from merriment to terror. This was the cue for armed men, loyal to Chancellor Crichton, to burst into the hall and seize the young nobles. King James was present at the dinner according to later chronicles, and by some accounts he watched in horror as his guests, who were also his cousins, were grabbed by soldiers. One version of the story even claims the boy king begged for the lives of the Douglas brothers, protesting that violating the sacred guest right was evil and dishonorable. But if James pleaded, his guardians ignored him. The Douglas brothers were hauled out of the hall and down to Castle Hill, where a sham trial for treason awaited. Outside, under whatever pale moonlight November offered, an impromptu tribunal accused William and David Douglas of plotting against the crown. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, given that William Douglas was 16 and had shown no active rebellion at that point, and his younger brother was literally a kid. Nonetheless, the outcome was preordained, and in a matter of moments, the boys were declared guilty of treason. The appalled 10-year-old king could only look on as his guests were butchered under his nominal authority. The Black Dinner's horror lies not only in its brutality, but in the utter betrayal of trust it represented. In medieval culture, to slay invited guests under your roof was a crime heinous enough to bring divine curse upon a host. The incident flagrantly violated the code of hospitality and also of kinship, since they were the king's relatives. If the event is taken at face value, the crown's regents had hoped to cripple the Douglas clan by eliminating its young leaders. Then their plan didn't have the neat outcome they expected. And trust me, I'm going to get into that in a moment, because there's ample evidence to suggest that the Black Dinner was somehow far more sinister than it appears. In fact, if anything, it demonstrated how precarious Crichton and Livingston's control really was. News of the disturbing act spread quickly, and many members of the Douglas faction reacted with the appropriate fury given the circumstances. And you may notice that I said many members here, because someone very important, who is about to be introduced, didn't seem too broken up by the whole event. For the time being, though, the enraged portion of Douglas supporters retaliated by laying siege to Edinburgh Castle. Sir William Crichton, who they believed orchestrated the banquet and was holed up in the castle, suddenly found himself under assault by forces loyal to the family. Realizing his vulnerable position, Crichton surrendered the castle to the Douglas faction forces. Rather than being punished for his role, however, Crichton managed to escape retribution and even kept royal favor. He handed Edinburgh Castle directly over to the young king and was later formally rewarded with a title for giving up his castle, or at least, that was the official story at the time. This medieval Scottish mystery is about to take a very hard turn into deeply conspiratorial territory. With the 6th Earl and his brother dead, the Douglas titles and estates passed to their great-uncle, James Douglas, Earl of Avondale. He was a chunky, middle-aged man, ominously nicknamed James the Gross. Tellingly, despite his 2 young great-nephews having been brutally slain, James the Gross showed no intention of avenging them. This inaction raised eyebrows in this violent age. It was customary for Scottish kin to seek vengeance for such slayings, yet James the Gross did nothing. It almost seemed a little bit too convenient, since he would have never inherited these titles otherwise. The Douglas family as an institution continued to dominate the royal court and government offices, filling them with Douglas relatives and allies. When King James II finally came of age in 1449 and began ruling in his own right, he discovered that the Douglas clan still had a stranglehold on the kingdom. The Black Dinner had removed 2 Douglas boys, but it hadn't eliminated the family's influence. Curiously, it seemed to have the exact opposite effect, and the family only seemed to grow in power under the authority of the 7th Earl of Douglas, James the Gross. How very curious indeed. Over the next decade, James II struggled to assert his authority against the entrenched might of the Douglases. The bitterness of the 1440 betrayal lingered in living memory. Eventually, in 1452, King James took his own revenge in an eerie echo of the Black Dinner. He invited William Douglas, 8th Earl of Douglas, the son of James the Gross, to Stirling Castle under a promise of safe conduct, then personally gutted him. This was a far cry from the boy king, who may have cried and tried to save his cousins by appealing to the rules of hospitality and the prohibitions against kinslaying. The 8th Earl of Douglas was, after all, both his guest and his kin. From the moment the Douglas boys were slain, one burning question has persisted. Who was truly behind the Black Dinner's heinous plot? The event had all the hallmarks of a carefully planned ambush rather than a spontaneous act. Yet the exact identity of its architect has been cloaked in some mystery, inviting debate among historians. At the time, popular opinion and later chronicles often blamed Sir William Crichton, the Chancellor, as the primary culprit. It was Crichton who controlled Edinburgh Castle and whose men physically carried out the arrests and executions. However, Crichton was not necessarily acting alone. Notably, Sir Alexander Livingston of Callander, who shared power with Crichton during the king's minority, is often mentioned as an accomplice. Livingston was deeply involved in the Regency's power plays, and some sources list both Crichton and Livingston as co-conspirators who together orchestrated this dark dinner theater. The reasoning is that both men feared the Douglas influence and theoretically collaborated to break the Douglas clan's power by decapitating its leadership both literally and figuratively. And that was the official version of the story that was accepted at the time. However, in the warm light of day, centuries afterwards, professional and amateur historians began to question this narrative. Beyond the royal advisors, intriguingly, suspicion also falls on a member of the Douglas clan itself. Modern historians increasingly view James the Gross, the victim's great-uncle who inherited the earldom, as a key beneficiary and perhaps the silent mastermind of the Black Dinner. At first glance, it sounds counterintuitive. Why would a Douglas betray his own kin in such a horrific manner? Well, if you've played Crusader Kings, you may have been able to intuitively figure out the answer to this already. James the Gross was an older cadet of the family with comparatively modest holdings, until his young great-nephew came along as Earl. If his great-nephews died without heirs, James stood to gain the entire Douglas inheritance instantly, and that is exactly what happened. By removing the two boys, James the Gross became 7th Earl, suddenly in possession of the vast Douglas possessions. Notably, in the wake of the Black Dinner, James not only took over the Douglas estates, but also aligned politically with Crichton. Modern scholars find the case against James the Gross compelling. They point out the telling detail that after becoming Earl, James never sought vengeance for William and David, an unusual omission in that era of Scottish feuds. His failure to prosecute or punish Crichton looks highly suspicious at the very least. Further, it makes virtually no sense strategically why Crichton would want to slay the two inexperienced brothers, knowing that their vast lands would fall to James the Gross. James the Gross had already proven himself to be a capable and dangerous man, unlike the two brothers. If Crichton had really wanted to diminish the power of the Douglas clan, it's argued that he would have only taken out the 16-year-old, leaving the much younger brother in charge. For reasons that make no sense strategically, he simply chose to remove both brothers, handing full control of this powerful clan to a capable rival. Crichton was heavily embroiled in late medieval power politics, and had proven himself to be very effective at advancing his own position. It seems unlikely that such a formidable man could make such a great oversight, especially given the conduct of James the Gross afterwards. Notably, contemporaries don't seem to have suspected James the Gross as being involved whatsoever, which strikes me as unusual. To put it in language that'll be familiar to all my Crusader Kings 3 players out there, it seems to me that James the Gross must have had a ridiculously high intrigue stat. Though I suppose perhaps not quite high enough, since James the Gross was one successful scheme away from becoming James III of Scotland, but of the House of Douglas, not Stuart. The Black Dinner of 1440 remains one of Scotland's most infamous betrayals, a night when dinner guests became victims and a royal castle became the scene of an atrocity. Its legacy has all the elements of a dark legend. Innocent young nobles, scheming lords, a duplicitous feast, and a violation of the ancient laws of hospitality. The mystery of who conceived this deed will likely continue to fascinate historians for generations. However, today, the prevailing view is that it was a conspiracy of interested parties. Most believe that Chancellor Crichton, Regent Livingston, and James the Gross all had their hands in the plot. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click like and subscribe and to share this video with your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership to support my channel further. It's London in 1665 and the Great Plague is raging, but even beyond the plague's terrifying toll, the weekly bills of mortality list other, more enigmatic causes of death. One entry in particular catches the eye with its almost poetic name, Rising of the Lights. It sounds like a mystical event, yet for people of the 17th and 18th centuries, this phrase was grimly real. It was not a metaphor or spiritual ascent, but a literal cause of death frequently recorded in parish registers and mortality bills. What on earth did Rising of the Lights mean? And what do modern scholars think these unfortunate sufferers actually died from? To understand the Rising of the Lights, we must step into the streets of early modern London. In those days, death was a constant visitor, and city officials kept track of it through weekly publications known as Bills of Mortality. These bills listed how many people died in each parish and the cause of each death. A special group of people called searchers went around and compiled what they thought that each person had died from. The searchers had no medical training, and they were often older women who examined the corpses and reported what they observed or what family members told them. The results were fascinating and often macabre. Alongside familiar terms like plague, smallpox, or consumption, one finds very curious labels. Notably, most of these weird labels are fully understood now by cross-referencing with other documents outside of the Bills of Mortality. Of these, only the Rising of the Lights remains a complete unknown, with some theories attempting to explain what it is, but no definitive proof. Notably, Rising of the Lights was among the more common of these old post-mortem diagnoses, which simply adds to the mystery. In the plague year of 1665, for example, London's annual bill recorded hundreds of deaths by Rising of the Lights. The phrase itself is likely, though not certainly, rooted in archaic language. Lights was a Middle English word for the lungs. So, if this etymology is accepted as factual, Rising of the Lights literally meant the rising of the lungs. I do need to emphasize, though, that while this may be a very likely theory, it isn't a certainty at all. However, this is the best we've got on the literal meaning of the term lights in the context, so most of the subsequent analysis will be predicated on the assumption that this is accurate. This language undoubtedly puzzled people even at the time, since it was a Middle English phrase used in the era of early modern and modern English. In essence, it would have essentially been the equivalent of using a long out-of-use word from the Victorian era to describe something more modern. But it's more confusing than that, because the word wouldn't be out of general usage, but rather would have continued on in other contexts, creating even more confusion. The name hints at what the searchers observed: signs of respiratory distress. In essence, some believe it may have been a 17th and 18th century catch-all term for any death associated with serious breathing trouble. If someone died gasping for air with a heaving chest and coughing, a searcher might shrug and record the cause as rising of the lights. It was a way to describe a horrible final struggle for breath, as if the person's lungs were obstructed or even rising up in the throat. Contemporary descriptions suggest what the symptoms looked like. One later source notes that doctors of the era said only common folk used the term, and that it was apparently only used to describe situations where it was fatal. In other words, the victim likely suffered a severe bout of choking or suffocation from within. We can imagine the scene: a patient wheezing and clutching their chest or throat, their voice reduced to a hoarse bark. Lacking modern terminology, observers resorted to vivid metaphor. The lungs, the lights, seemed to rise up and cut off the breath. It's a haunting image, and it left a strong enough impression to earn a permanent line in the mortality rolls. At this point, you may be wondering, what actual illness were these people dying from? Over the centuries, medical historians and scholars have combed through these old records to translate archaic diagnoses into modern terms. The consensus is that rising of the lights corresponds to a respiratory condition, most likely what we now call croup. Croup is an infection of the larynx and trachea that leads to swelling in a child's airway, causing labored breathing and a distinctive barking cough. It often strikes infants and young children, and without modern treatments, it can indeed be fatal. However, the term was broadly applied by people without medical training who perhaps had never seen someone actually pass from the rising of the lights in person. In the end, we simply don't know for sure what it meant, or if it even meant one thing at all. Searchers didn't have any medical training whatsoever, and the bills of mortality simply reported what they said. Further yet, the term has never been used by physicians in any capacity, and since it was only recorded as a cause of death, we have no records of legitimate physicians treating it. In the summer of 1829, the people of Osaka witnessed a grim spectacle that seemed torn from the history books. 6 condemned souls, 3 men and 3 women, were paraded through the bustling city streets. Some of them were already dead, their corpses preserved in salt for the occasion. In a final act of punishment, authorities bound each victim to a cross and methodically pierced them with spears. One male prisoner writhed in agony as the spikes struck. A woman named Toyota Mitsugi, the lone surviving female, reportedly laughed as the first spear was driven through her body, maintaining an eerie composure. This dramatic mass execution, complete with crucifixions in the heart of a major city, sent shockwaves through late Edo period Japan and left onlookers horrified. What heinous acts had these people committed to warrant such an extraordinary punishment, normally reserved for the worst traitors? To answer that, we must unravel the strange tale of the 1827 Osaka incident. This is a tale of secret rituals, sorcery, and the shadow of Christianity in a land where the faith had been banned for nearly 2 centuries. For over 200 years before this incident, Japan's Tokugawa shogunate had outlawed Christianity. Ever since the early 17th century, when Catholic missionaries and converts were persecuted and expelled, open practice of the Christian faith had vanished from the country. The authorities took pride in the idea that Christianity had been eradicated by the 1640s after brutal campaigns of suppression. By the 18th and early 19th century, the official stance was that there simply were no Christians left. at least none foolish enough to announce themselves. Christians were remembered in popular culture only as vanquished rebels and sorcerers from a bygone era. Plays, folk tales, and cheaply printed chapbooks portrayed Christians as cunning sorcerers and subversives who had once threatened to undermine Japan's social order. And trust me when I say it, the version of Christianity presented doesn't bear any resemblance to any of the concepts you're familiar with. For one, it's unlikely that you see Jesus as a sinister, rebellious wizard sent to Earth to destroy the Japanese social order, though perhaps your interpretations differ from mine. In these lurid stories, the Christians, called Kirishitan in Japanese, were depicted as villainous magicians. They were agents of foreigners who performed black magic and plotted to overthrow the country. By 1827, no one in Japan had ever met a native Japanese Christian, at least not that they knew of. Real Christians in Japan were, of course, not sorcerers, but a highly persecuted minority who practiced their faith in secret, trying to stay under the radar. Yet despite this, the specter of Christianity still haunted the ruling elite's nightmares. The belief that Christians had secretly infiltrated all levels of the Japanese samurai government was common. These supposedly sinister Christians were believed to be internally promoting the idea that all people were inherently equal. This completely undermined the social order, directly from the top, because it said that the emperor wasn't divine. Perhaps more importantly, it also meant that the shogun, ruling in the emperor's place for all temporal and non-ritualistic matters, wasn't wielding delegated divine authority. But all this fear wasn't entirely unwarranted or self-interested. Representatives of Christianity had actually threatened the Japanese social order in the past, with the Jesuits playing various roles of questionable legitimacy in the late Sengoku period. Even with no open church, the Tokugawa state kept up certain precautions. In many domains, authorities continued the practice of fumi-e, the ritual of trampling images, well into the 19th century. Those whose ancestors had once been Christian, or who fell under suspicion, were forced to step upon bronze images of Jesus or Mary. This supposedly proved that they had no allegiance to these figures. Refusal or hesitation to defile these sacred images was taken as evidence of Christian belief. According to scholars, real believers would supposedly recoil from desecrating Christ's likeness, thereby revealing themselves. This was based on the mistaken belief that Christians believed that a life essence of Jesus Christ or Mary were in these images. Interestingly, this fumi process ended up having the exact opposite effect that was intended, even though it did end up drawing out Christians. Japanese hidden Christians wished to participate in this process since it was the only time they could safely view images of Jesus and Mary out in the open. In general, the clandestine believers had adapted their faith over generations, disguising Christian icons as Buddhist figures. Japanese Christians commonly kept figures of the Bodhisattva of mercy, known to the Japanese as Lady Canon, to represent the Virgin Mary. For Jesus, they would often keep statues of Amida, the Buddha of light and compassion. Since these were two of the most popular religious icons in Japan, this didn't raise any suspicion. Further, the propagandists in the Tokugawa government had portrayed Christians as deranged occultists, set on destroying the social order. The idea that they would keep figures representing infinite love and compassion really didn't seem comprehensible to the authorities, at least in most cases. For many Japanese Christians during this period, this supposed humiliation ritual would be the only time they would ever see proper images of Jesus and Mary. Every other time they would look at Lady Canon and the Buddha Amida and imagine, since keeping actual Christian iconography was simply too risky. Using this method, the Tokugawa authorities believed that there were no actual Christians in Japan since the 17th century. After all, even when they went to areas where people were suspected to be Christian, everyone seemed surprisingly zealous about getting out there and stepping on these images. This is why the events that began in Osaka in 1827 were so shocking. For the first time in centuries, authorities claimed to have uncovered active Christian devotees. Officials feared that everything they had read in old tales about Kirishitan sorcery and sedition was coming true again, threatening the social order in their own backyard. What they actually found, however, turned out to be far stranger and more tragic than a straightforward Christian revival. It all started with reports of odd goings-on among the urban underclass. Osaka in the late Edo period was a commercial metropolis teeming with people of all walks of life. Aside from merchants and craftsmen, the city had its share of down-and-out drifters, street preachers, and folk healers offering cures and fortunes for a fee. In early 1827, city officials caught wind of a small circle of such practitioners, mostly women, who were performing peculiar rituals and claiming to channel otherworldly powers. These women were ostensibly Inari shrine mediums. Inari, the Shinto god of rice and fox spirits, was popularly worshipped for blessings in everything from business to fertility. Mediums would go into trances and let the god's voice speak through them, dispensing advice or healing. It wasn't unusual to find Inari mediums in Osaka's neighborhoods, offering spiritual services on the fringes of religious orthodoxy. What was unusual were the whispers that some of these mediums were invoking something other than Inari. They had built a small shrine which they claimed housed a deity called Tente, meaning the Lord of Heaven. Clients seeking cures or divinations from these women heard them chant an incantation that sounded foreign to Japanese ears, a phrase rendered as Zensu Maru Haraiso. I don't speak Japanese, but apparently this phrase is essentially Western-sounding gibberish to a Japanese audience. Unbeknownst to the listeners, this was a garbled attempt at saying, Jesus Maria, Paradise. In other words, the mediums were mixing the names of Jesus Christ and Mary into their spell. Furthermore, they conducted secretive rites that included mysterious writings and rituals, all centered around a sacred image they called the Lord of Heaven. This image doesn't survive, and it's unclear if this was a depiction of God or something else entirely. The leader of this little circle was a middle-aged widow named Toyota Mitsugi. Outwardly, Mitsugi appeared to be just another fortune teller and faith healer trying to make a living. She and her associates would perform healing prayers and exorcisms for paying customers. They operated under the convenient cover of Inari worship, which was acceptable to the public, but also considered kind of weird and unorthodox. In essence, conducting an unusual Inari ritual would just be written off as the kind of unusual thing that Inari mediums did. But behind closed doors, Mitsugi had introduced a very different kind of devotion. Those initiated into her inner circle would learn that this Lord of Heaven, the strange mantra Zensu Maru Haraiso, was in fact calling on Jesus and Mary for salvation. How on earth did an Osaka peasant woman learn about Jesus Christ in the 1820s with no missionaries around and with native Japanese Christians laying low? The answer lies with a shadowy figure named Mizuno Gunki. Gunki was already dead by 1827, but a few years prior he had been the mentor who set Mitsugi on this path. By all accounts, Mizuno Gunki was a charismatic con man turned mystic. One of those colorful characters who drifts through the fringes of respectable society. He had some education, and even connections to noble circles in Kyoto, but also a history of swindling. At some point, Gunki had a religious awakening of sorts and became obsessed with Christian teachings. Importantly, his knowledge of Christianity did not come from any secret priest or foreign source. Rather, Gunki had read about the quote, Jesus sect in Japanese books. These were likely the very same popular tales and persecution records that portrayed Christians as powerful sorcerers and Jesus as a sinister Saruman-like figure. In other words, Gunki only knew about Christianity from anti-Christian propaganda, which portrayed practitioners of the faith as literal wizards. Impressed by these stories, Gunki apparently believed that by mastering the forbidden religion, he could tap into supernatural powers. Filtered through anti-Christian propaganda, he believed he would even have the ability to resurrect the dead, and perhaps even attain eternal life himself. He spread these ideas to a small group of followers in the Osaka-Kyoto area. Mitsugi was introduced to Gunki around 1822 by a local tea house owner who knew of her spiritual ambitions. Mitsugi learned the exotic names and rituals from Gunki, and after his death in 1824, she took up the mantle of leader. It's important to note that most scholars believe neither Mitsugi nor Gunki had any apparent direct connection to the traditional hidden Christian communities. They were essentially reinventing Christianity from rumors and books, filling in gaps with their own imagination. That said, I'll be coming back to this in a moment, because there's the slim possibility that this mystery goes much deeper than one might imagine. By mid-1827, rumors of Mitsugi's unorthodox shrine and spellcasting had reached the ears of Osaka's city magistrates. An investigation was launched, led in part by a diligent samurai official named Oshio Heihachiro. Oshio and his colleague painstakingly tracked the threads of this case through both Osaka and Kyoto, uncovering a surprisingly broad network of people involved in the strange sect. What they found was a motley crew drawn from various walks of life. Mitsugi's circle included not just poor widows, but also a couple of male devotees, including a samurai and even a Shinto priest. They didn't form an underground church, but rather an association where they discussed forbidden magic they believe was granted by the Lord of Heaven himself. As the investigators interrogated these suspects, a picture of the group's practices emerged. Mitsugi and her female disciples would go into trance-like states, claiming to be possessed by Inari, but then use Christian prayers to attempt healings. They were play-acting a Japanese fantasy of Christian sorcery, hoping to harness the legendary magic of the Kirishitan for their personal benefit. And when I say their personal benefit, I'm referring to the ability to make money from their wizardry. All sources seem to suggest that they truly believed that they were tapping into a much more powerful divinity than anyone knew. This is where their practice differs from the cartoonish propaganda depictions. They appear to believe that they had acquired insanely powerful magic from God and Jesus, and they didn't see anything wrong with profiting a bit on the side in return for legitimate healings. The authorities saw no difference between this unusual form of magic and Christian practice. After all, Mitsugi's followers were behaving exactly how the Christians in Edo-era propaganda behaved. According to investigators, they weren't just trying to use foreign magic to make a quick buck. They were using their sinister magic to win over people to their subversive sect and turn them against Japanese society as a whole. Osaka's magistrates chose to treat the whole thing as a full-blown Christian conspiracy, despite the fact that no church activities had actually been uncovered. The distinction between a diluted magic cult and an actual secret church was lost in the fear that gripped the officials. The accused were subjected to intense interrogation over many months. In Edo period justice, this often meant extreme methods to extract full confessions. especially in cases of serious crimes. Detailed testimonies were compiled in which each defendant recounted their life story and involvement with Christianity. Reading these records today, one can sense both the confusion of the accused and the almost theatrical zeal of the interrogators. Mitsugi, when pressed, proudly owned up to learning Christian magic from Gunki and attempting to awe others with it. She insisted, however, that she meant no harm to the government. Her aims were personal, not political. In essence, all the members of the sect argued that they were simply practicing sorcery, which was a minor offense, not practicing Christianity, which was a capital offense. When the investigation concluded, Osaka officials urged severe punishment, and after significant debate, it was decided that everyone would be crucified. It appears the shogunate wanted to send an unmistakable message. No matter how small or strange, any form of Christianity was still a mortal crime in Japan. When authorities went to carry out the sentences in 1829, they found that time had thinned the ranks of the condemned. Of the 6, only 2 were still alive in prison, including Mitsugi, the leader of the sect. The shogunate's mandate, however, was unwavering, and even the dead would not be spared punishment. In a macabre gesture, the 4 corpses were packed in salt to preserve them. There, the authorities tied up all 6 individuals, 2 living and 4 deceased, on raised crosses for display. Executioners then dispatched the living pair by piercing them with spears, the method traditionally used for crucifixion in Japan. To complete the ritual, they also thrust spears into the lifeless bodies, as if to symbolically execute the dead all over again. The immediate impact of the incident was a wave of alarm throughout the country. The event fed into a growing anti-Christian paranoia in late Edo society. It came on the heels of those scholarly warnings about Western infiltration. The fact that they were mostly lower-class women and marginal figures only heightened official fears that the most vulnerable segments of society might be seduced by Christianity. In reality, as we've seen, Mitsugi's group had no ties to foreign agents or real missionaries. Their idea of Jesus was that of a divine, rule-breaking wizard, an extremely unorthodox idea cobbled together from anti-Christian sources. Meanwhile, the story of the Osaka incident began to take on a life of its own in popular imagination. One particularly sensational thread of rumor tied the incident to a dramatic event a decade later: Oshio Heihachiro's 1837 rebellion. Oshio, remember, had been one of the lead investigators who cracked the case in 1827. In 1837, he became disillusioned with the shogunate and led a violent uprising in Osaka in protest of officials hoarding rice during a famine. After Oshio's rebellion was crushed, some whisperers looked for supernatural explanations for how a loyal lawman turned into a treasonous rebel. They seized upon his connection to the Mitsugi case. Soon, lurid tales claimed that Oshio had been possessed by the vengeful spirit of Mitsugi, that the witch he sent to her death had cursed him and warped his mind. Other versions suggested Oshio had secretly been converted to the Kirishitan sect by Mitsugi's teachings or by her ghost. And yeah, just when you think this story has everything already, it has a ghost converting people to a super hardcore metal version of Christianity where Jesus is a powerful wizard. Under this theory, he used the black magic he learned from her to try to topple the government. Of course, none of this was true in a literal sense, but this didn't stop it from being a widely held belief at the time. With all that said, one major question still lingers about Mitsugi's sect. For the last 2 centuries, it's been speculated that perhaps they were very legitimate underground Christians, and that they were essentially playing a game of sect inception. Under this theory, they posed as Inari worshippers, pretending to follow a cartoonish version of Christianity that lined up perfectly with the propaganda. Meanwhile, they may have used this as an actual tool to spread Christianity once individuals became acclimatized to the process. This would also provide cover if they were caught, since they could claim they were practicing sorcery, not Christianity. In fact, as I had mentioned earlier, this was the defense raised by everyone in the sect. They weren't actual Christians, but rather just dabbling in an unusual form of sorcery, a crime sure, but nothing too serious by Edo standards. Notably, there's no proof that this is the case, but the idea that they were actually real hidden Christians expanding the faith in an unorthodox way has fascinated observers for centuries. Imagine waking up in the dead of night to a strange sensation, not of pain or theft, but the eerie realization that someone had been in your bedroom and cut off a lock of your hair. It sounds like a campfire horror story, yet in 1942, the people of Pascagoula, Mississippi, lived this nightmare. An unknown prowler dubbed the Phantom Barber crept into homes at night and sheared off people's hair as they slept, disappearing into the darkness without a trace. Interestingly, there's credible evidence to suggest this weird occurrence was actually a psychological operation carried out by the Axis powers. In the early 1940s, Pascagoula was a town on edge even before the Phantom Barber arrived. The population had tripled almost overnight due to the boom at the local shipyard due to the global conflict that had engulfed the world. Although this boom brought economic growth, it also strained Pascagoula's small police force and led to more petty crimes in town, even before the Phantom attacks started. Blackout rules kept the city dim at night to prevent enemy attacks, cloaking neighborhoods in near-total darkness each night. War paranoia ran high, with German U-boats reportedly lurking in the Gulf of Mexico. People suspected that any neighbor or newcomer could be an enemy spy. In this tense atmosphere, the sudden string of hair-snipping break-ins sent Pascagoula into full-blown panic. The first reported incident came around midnight on June 5, 1942, at the Our Lady of Victory's convent. Two girls, 11-year-old Mary Evelyn Briggs and 12-year-old Edna Marie Heidel, awoke to see a shadowy man. One girl later described him as a short, stocky figure in a light-colored sweatshirt, and the girl's screams rang out, but the intruder had already vanished. Each girl found a chunk of her hair had been neatly clipped off, and the two youngsters were both shaken and stirred, but otherwise unharmed. Just a few days later, the Phantom Barber struck again. This time the target was 6-year-old Carol Petty, who was asleep in her bedroom across town on a Monday night. The intruder cut open the window screen and crept in while Carol and her twin brother slept. By morning, Carol's lovely blonde curls had been cruelly shorn. Her brother, beside her, didn't appear to have any of his hair taken. The bold prowler once again vanished without seriously harming anyone, taking only stolen locks of hair. At the Petty home, investigators did find one clue: a sandy footprint on a chair beneath the window, suggesting the culprit had stood there to enter and exit. The community was alarmed and baffled, and law enforcement was stumped. The police chief admitted he couldn't imagine what would drive a person to commit such bizarre break-ins. Aside from the cut window screens and an occasional footprint, the Phantom left little trace. All the targets so far were young and female, which led parents to dread that their own daughters might be next. Many residents began sealing their windows shut despite the summer heat. Then the pattern shifted dramatically. In mid-June, the intruder invaded the bedroom of the Heidelbergs, a local couple, and attacked them with an iron bar. Both survived, but the violent assault marked a dangerous escalation from the earlier hair thefts. Some in town questioned if this was even the same perpetrator, since nothing was stolen not even hair, and the brutality was unprecedented. Nevertheless, police believed the phantom barber had turned violent. The very next week, a final incident seemed to confirm the barber's evolving tactics. A woman named Miss Taylor woke feeling a nauseating smell, and later discovered a portion of her hair had been cut off while she was unconscious. Investigators suspected the intruder used an anesthetic to keep her asleep while he took her hair. It was another brazen break-in and assault, though fortunately Miss Taylor was not otherwise harmed. For several weeks that summer, Pascagoula felt under siege by an invisible menace. With a prowler literally cutting hair off people's heads, everyday life took a surreal turn. Men refused to leave home for night shifts at the shipyard, insisting on guarding their families, causing significant delays in building ships for the fight against the Axis. Nearly every able-bodied man armed himself and joined in local neighborhood watch groups, again leading to diminished output at the local factories. The authorities publicly promised that they would have the case fully wrapped up by July 1942 and deployed all their resources to catching the Phantom. In a rare move, the Army relaxed the town's nighttime blackout restrictions to shed a bit of light on the streets, hoping to make it harder for the prowler to hide. Despite these efforts, July 1942 arrived with no arrests and no new leads. The phantom barber seemed impossible to catch. To make matters stranger, a rash of other nighttime intrusions was reported nearby. In those incidents, the prowler did not cut hair at all, but would slice open window screens and scatter clothing and dishes around the homes. Whether this was the phantom barber indulging in further mischief or a copycat playing pranks, nobody could say. Finally, in August 1942, the case took a turn, which suggested that this whole string of incidents may have been something even more sinister. Police arrested 57-year-old William A. Dolan, a chemist who had studied in Germany, and accused him of being the phantom barber. He was initially brought in due to his feud with the Heidelbergs, the couple who had been viciously attacked, and the authorities wasted no time pinning the scare on Dolan. The police chief speculated that Dolan's goal in the hair-cutting spree was to impair the morale of workers, effectively accusing him of being a saboteur on behalf of the Germans. Notably, neighbors whispered that Dolan had very strong pro-German sympathies. The narrative quickly formed that this disgruntled, German-educated chemist had terrorized Pascagoula as the phantom barber. Dolan was formally charged, not with the hair snippings, but with the attack on the Heidelbergs. That was the most serious offense, and the one charge authorities felt confident would stick, and his trial was swift. Fueled by the community's palpable relief and anger, the jury took only a few hours to convict Dolan of the assault, and the judge handed down a 10-year prison sentence. At last, Pascagoula could sleep peacefully again, convinced that the nightmare was over. For the first time in months, residents let their guard down, believing the Phantom was safely behind bars. Years later, doubts began to surface about whether Dolan was really the phantom barber. He always insisted he was innocent, and in 1948 he even passed a lie detector test arranged by the state governor, though of course those aren't exactly a science. Citing the ambiguous evidence and public hysteria surrounding the case, the governor granted Dolan an early release, and he was eventually pardoned entirely. The case of the phantom barber thus remains technically unsolved, and there are some serious questions floating about the attacks in general. While the question of whether Dolan was responsible for any or all of the attacks remains unsolved, the most interesting question is whether a saboteur was at play. The prevailing wartime theory was that a German agent or sympathizer carried out the attacks to undermine local industrial production through fear. The phantom barber's timing and effect, causing skilled workers to stay home, did hurt the shipyard output, lending some credence to this idea. Although no direct proof of spy activity was found, this idea made sense to many frightened residents in 1942. Some have speculated that if it was discovered that German agents were at play, this information wouldn't have been released to the public. Americans were already worried about foreign agents disrupting factory production, and confirmation that this really happened would have caused even more disruption. However, after relations with Germany and the United States normalized, there was no indication that sabotage took place in Pascagoula. That said, it's always possible that the records related to any such psychological operation were destroyed, or that the people responsible either weren't alive or weren't talking. Interestingly, some have speculated that aside from the attack on the Heidelbergs, that the entirety of the incident could be chalked up to mass hysteria. Under this theory, the Phantom Barber never actually existed and was simply a manifestation of the fear and anxiety felt on the home front during the conflict. Ultimately, whether a German agent or sympathizer carried out the attacks to disrupt industrial output will continue to remain an unsolved mystery. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click like and subscribe and to share this video with your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership to support my channel further. In classical literature, a rare creature called the Arabian flying snake was frequently mentioned as a real, factual creature. Greek and Roman writers described winged serpents in the Arabian deserts guarding frankincense trees. Herodotus, the 5th century BC Greek writer, who is often regarded as the first person to attempt to record history in a somewhat factual way, provides the earliest detailed account. And note that I say a somewhat factual way here, because there are a lot of very questionable accounts by Herodotus, which he claims are totally real and accurate. In the histories, he claims Arabia produced precious incense, but that it was guarded by swarms of countless winged serpents that hung in the frankincense trees. To collect the resin, the Arabians would burn another form of incense, whose smoke drove away the serpents. Herodotus also reported that each spring these flying snakes tried to migrate into Egypt. They were intercepted and slain en masse by flocks of ibis birds at a mountain pass, an image that sounds like it belongs on a heavy metal album cover. According to Herodotus, this is why Egyptians honored the ibis as a sacred creature. He even claimed to have seen heaps of snake bones in a desert gorge near the Nile, offered as proof of this tale. Herodotus, who loved a good story, didn't skimp on the more lurid details as well. The winged snake's own reproduction was said to be so violent that both snakes perished the vast majority of the time. Again, I feel the Arabian winged snake legend really lends itself to heavy metal album art. Herodotus speculated that without this dangerous reproductive ritual, these snakes would have likely expanded to every corner of the world. Interestingly, an Assyrian record from 670 BC also mentions winged serpents in the deserts near Egypt. This indicates that this was a common story that was flying around the ancient world at the time. Also, as a quick aside, I just noticed the pun while I was editing this video. Not an intentional one, sadly. Later writers repeated the tale of Arabia's flying serpents, with Pliny the Elder later writing skeptically on the flying snakes. According to Pliny, he believed that the stories of the flying attack snakes were spread by Arabian merchants to maintain their stranglehold on frankincense and drive up prices. No real flying snake species is known from Arabia or anywhere else, so modern scholars have sought alternative explanations for these reports. One idea is that the winged snake was pure folklore, a clever bit of storytelling. As Pliny suspected, local traders may have spread frightening myths to protect their monopoly on frankincense. A deadly flying reptile would certainly deter casual adventurers from even bothering to go to the region. Another theory points to paleontology. Desert cliffs in the region might have exposed mysterious bones that inspired the legend. For example, fossil remains of large sail-crested reptiles eroding from the rocks could be misinterpreted as the skeletons of winged dragons killed by ibises long ago. Without a scientific framework, ancient people could easily explain puzzling bone beds with imaginative stories. From there, local traders could have realized that this makes a great excuse to keep those who want to obtain local riches far away. Others suggest the tale had a basis in sightings of actual creatures, later exaggerated into myth. Perhaps venomous cobras or desert snakes were seen leaping, and creative storytellers described them as winged. Others have suggested swarms of locusts and bats in Arabian skies might have been compared to flying serpents, though there's no evidence for this. Such comparisons could have theoretically evolved into a legend of literal winged snakes over the course of generations. In reality, there are species of gliding snakes that can leap and sail between tree branches, but those exist only in South Asia, not in Arabia. That said, these areas of the world were connected through trade. It's possible that the tail of the snake jumped and glided to the Arabian Peninsula and flew throughout the Mediterranean world from there. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were two of the most notorious outlaws of the American Wild West, famed for their string of bank and train robberies in the 1890s and at the turn of the century. Butch Cassidy, born Robert Leroy Parker in 1866 in Utah, led the Wild Bunch gang and cultivated a reputation as a charismatic Robin Hood-like bandit. In fact, those who knew Cassidy described him as charismatic and generous, with a distaste for violence. His partner in crime, Harry Alonzo Longabaugh, better known as the Sundance Kid, was a Pennsylvania-born outlaw who earned his nickname after a stint in jail in Sundance, Wyoming. Together with the Wild Bunch, Cassidy and Sundance brazenly held up banks, stagecoaches, and trains across the Rocky Mountain states. These high-profile heists raised the profiles of the men to stratospheric heights. By the turn of the 20th century, facing intense pursuit by the Pinkerton Detective Agency and other lawmen, the pair decided that escape was the better part of valor. In 1901, Butch Cassidy, Sundance, and Sundance's gal pal Etta Place fled the United States for South America to evade capture. They initially tried to settle into an honest life, even homesteading a ranch in Argentina's Cholila Valley. But old habits died hard. By 1905, reports indicated that they returned to banditry, robbing banks and payroll transports in Argentina and Bolivia. Pinkerton agents had distributed wanted posters and warnings about the duo throughout South America, which kept pressure on the outlaws even abroad. By late 1908, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid's South American exploits appeared to catch up with them. According to conventional historical accounts, their story culminated in a remote Bolivian village after a robbery gone wrong. In early November 1908, two masked American bandits held up a courier from the Aramayo Franca Mining Company in southern Bolivia, stealing the company payroll. Bolivian authorities, alerted by descriptions of the culprits, pursued the bandits to the village of San Vicente. There, on the evening of November 6, 1908, a local cavalry patrol surrounded a small adobe house where two foreign suspects, believed to be Cassidy and Longabaugh, were holed up. As soldiers closed in, the cornered outlaws opened fire, cutting down one Bolivian soldier in the initial volley. A brief firefight ensued until darkness fell over San Vicente. What happened next in that Bolivian standoff is the stuff of legend. Villagers and the local mayor later testified that around 2 a.m., after the firefight had subsided, screams were heard from inside the house, followed by two shots. By morning, when authorities entered the hut, they found two bodies on the floor. The man thought to be the Sundance Kid was slumped against a wall with multiple bullet wounds and a shot to the forehead. The man presumed to be Cassidy lay next to him with a hole in his temple. The evidence suggested a grim narrative. Rather than be taken alive, Cassidy may have ended his mortally wounded friend and then deleted himself. This somber ending starkly contrasts with the famous 1969 film portrayal of a blaze of glory shootout, but it largely aligns with the contemporary Bolivian reports. However, crucially, no one conclusively identified the bodies in San Vicente as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The courier who had been robbed, Carlos Pero, was brought to view the corpses and claimed they were the same men who robbed him. Yet he had only seen the robbers' eyes under their bandanas and couldn't offer positive identification. No photographs were taken of the dead outlaws, and the two bodies were hastily buried in an unmarked grave in the local cemetery. The lack of definitive proof left an evidentiary void. Although descriptions of the deceased bandits roughly matched Cassidy and Longabaugh, the uncertainty meant that doubts and rumors began to creep in almost immediately. Did Butch and Sundance truly meet their end in Bolivia, or had they pulled off one final audacious escape? In the absence of absolute proof of Cassidy's and Sundance's demise, rumors of their survival took root and flourished. For decades after 1908, various eyewitness accounts and family testimonies fueled speculation that the two outlaws lived out quiet lives under assumed identities. Among the earliest and most persistent claims came from Cassidy's own family. His youngest sister, Lula Parker Bettinson, steadfastly maintained that her famous brother didn't perish in Bolivia. In her 1975 memoir, Butch Cassidy, My Brother, Lula recounted that Butch returned to the family ranch in Circleville, Utah, in 1925, 17 years after his supposed demise. Family members who were present recalled a middle-aged man with Cassidy's unmistakable grin arriving in a shiny new Ford automobile to pay a clandestine visit. According to Lula, during this reunion, Cassidy described his post-outlaw wanderings and even divulged how he and Sundance faked their ends. Cassidy claimed that an old friend, Percy Seibert, who worked at a Bolivian mine, had identified two bandits as Butch and Sundance to fool the authorities. If true, this story suggests that the notorious duo staged the San Vicente shootout narrative as a cover for their getaway. Lula Parker Bettinson further asserted that her brother lived out his remaining years quietly under an alias, supposedly in Washington state, and died of natural causes in 1937. As Lula put it, the family wanted to let the outlaw finally rest in peace away from the spotlight. Cassidy's alleged 1925 homecoming is far from the only eyewitness tale. In the American West, anecdotes of Butch Cassidy's post-1908 survival became a kind of folklore. Residents of Cassidy's old haunts in Utah and Wyoming swore they saw him in the 1930s, long after Bolivia. One Utah woman later recalled being introduced to a kind ranch guest, who her parents noted to be Butch Cassidy, well after the outlaw's supposed end. In Wyoming, a retired lawman named Jack Gomer claimed he shared a drink with Cassidy in 1930. Notably, he had met Cassidy during their respective careers. In another account, a former Wild Bunch member said Cassidy visited friends in the Wind River region of Wyoming in 1935. The most famous survival theory surrounding Butch Cassidy coalesced around the figure of William Phillips, an aging machinist in Spokane, Washington. In 1934, Phillips authored a mysterious manuscript titled The Bandit Invincible, a thinly veiled biography of Butch Cassidy that some have interpreted as Cassidy's own autobiography. Phillips, who died in 1937, never outright claimed to be Cassidy, but he dropped numerous hints and seemed to relish the speculation. In the 1970s, historian Larry Pointer publicized the Phillips theory, arguing that details in the Bandit Invincible were so precise that only the real Cassidy could have known them. Pointer and other researchers pointed to eerie similarities between Cassidy's known life and Phillips's story. For instance, the manuscript describes obscure events like a Wyoming prison warden offering Cassidy a handshake and pardon in 1895, which Cassidy refused. This is an incident corroborated by real prison records, which according to Pointer and others could only have been known by Butch Cassidy himself. They also noted that Phillips had married and settled in the U.S. just months after Cassidy's last known letter from Bolivia. Further, in the 1930s, Phillips allegedly confided his secret to close friends in Spokane. To believers, Phillips was Butch Cassidy living under an assumed name, and the manuscript was his way of telling his own tale. Skeptics, however, find the Phillips theory dubious. Investigative work eventually revealed that William Phillips was likely an ex-convict from Michigan who had crossed paths with Cassidy in prison in Wyoming. Some have speculated that Phillips may have borrowed Butch's legend to add luster to his own life story. Most scholars now consider Phillips an imposter who capitalized on the Cassidy mystique rather than the genuine article. Compared to Cassidy, Harry Longabaugh has fewer claimed post-1908 sightings, but he hasn't been immune to speculation. One elaborate theory put forward in the 2000s claimed that the Sundance Kid assumed the alias William Henry Long and lived out his days as a rancher in Utah. Researchers obtained permission to exhume Long's remains in 2008 in hopes of a DNA match to Sundance's relatives. The results, however, didn't deliver the confirmation they sought. DNA tests failed to link the exhumed bones to the Longabaugh family, coming back negative. More than a century later, the ultimate fate of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid straddles the line between historical fact and folklore. On one hand, most historians trust the evidence that the two bandits died in Bolivia in 1908. As reported by the authorities at the time. The South American police archives unearthed by researchers included authentic letters written by Butch and Sundance from Argentina up to 1908. No verified records place Cassidy or Longabaugh alive beyond that date, and extensive investigations have yet to produce evidence proving their survival. Notably in the 1990s, a researcher attempted to recover the bodies of the two men in Bolivia. However, the DNA evidence didn't end up matching up with family members of the men, indicating that the researcher either found the wrong bodies or that other men were buried there. This is of course complicated by the fact that Butch and Sundance were buried in an unmarked grave. At present, there's no definitive proof that Butch and Sundance perished in Bolivia, but conversely conclusive evidence has never come out proving that they survived. What can be said with certainty is that the two outlaws dropped off the official historical record after November 1908. Whether this was because they perished in a firefight, as the official story goes, or because they took it as their opportunity to retire, remains an unsolved mystery. In the blistering heat of the Central Australian desert, a man lies dying in a remote cave. Harold Lassiter is starving, his eyes blinded by sand and sun, scratching final lines into his diary. He had claimed to have found a fortune in gold, a motherlode so rich it could make a nation wealthy. Yet in his last agonizing hours, he would have traded that entire bounty for a single loaf of bread and a cup of water. This is the tragic and tantalizing tale of Lassiter's Reef, a mystery that has haunted the Australian outback for nearly a century. Lassiter's Reef is perhaps Australia's most famous lost treasure legend. The story has all the ingredients of an epic: an outback drifter's claim of an impossibly rich gold deposit, a grand expedition into uncharted desert, and a desperate final journey that cost a man his life. Harold Lassiter perished in 1931 without ever proving his golden find, but his story did not die with him. Instead, the legend of a hidden reef of gold took on a life of its own, luring fortune hunters and sparking debate for decades to come. In 1929, amid the Great Depression, Lassiter came forward with a bold proclamation. Years earlier, he insisted he had discovered a quote-unquote vast gold-bearing reef somewhere in Central Australia. If you can't tell, I'm not an Aussie, but a reef is a vein of valuable minerals or metals. I'm not sure if this is an old-timey word or if it's still popular in Australia these days, so let me know in the comments if you're from the former Habsburg holdings down under. Funny story, just a quick aside, but the confusion between Austria and Australia will never not be funny to me. Years ago, I had a very bizarre dream that was inspired by this mix-up. Let's just say it featured a giant koala in a eucalyptus leaf dirndl, a man who looked suspiciously like the late great Steve Irwin dressed up in lederhosen, and the most surreal waltz ever. But yeah, let's get back on script. Harold wrote to a federal politician describing a huge gold deposit out in the desert, reportedly stretching for miles and incredibly rich in ore. According to this letter, he had found the site around 1911, but lacked the means to develop it at the time. Government officials were dubious, especially when they learned Lassiter had been living on a farm during the period he claimed to be prospecting, and they ultimately dismissed his story. Undeterred by this setback, Lassiter tried again in early 1930. He approached John Bailey of the Australian Workers' Union and spun his tale anew, this time claiming the discovery had actually occurred 33 years earlier, when he was just 17. In this version, Lassiter said his horses had died during a trek across the interior, and that he'd been rescued by a surveyor named Harding, who let him in on a wee golden secret. Such inconsistencies in Lassiter's story raised eyebrows even then. Nevertheless, the lure of a colossal gold strike during hard times proved irresistible. By mid-1930, a syndicate of investors had agreed to fund an expedition to search for Lassiter's reef. The expedition that set out from Alice Springs in July 1930 was lavishly equipped for its day, complete with motor vehicles and even a small airplane for aerial scouting. The team included seasoned bushman Fred Blakely as leader and Lassiter as guide, along with a handful of other men eager to find the treasure. It wasn't long before reality set in. The desert proved punishing. Trucks bogged in sand and broke down, the airplane crashed, and their radio failed, cutting off contact. As weeks passed with no trace of the gold reef, the crew's confidence in Lassiter plummeted. The guide's behavior grew peculiar. He was sullen and uncooperative, often singing hymns or writing in his diary instead of helping navigate. Eventually, expedition leader Blakely decided that Lassiter's supposed reef was a wild goose chase. Fed up, he accused Lassiter of fraud and elected to quit the search and turn back. By September 1930, the main party had abandoned the mission, effectively stranding Lassiter in the wilderness. Lassiter, however, refused to quit. Determined to find the reef on his own, he joined with a camel handler named Paul Johns and pressed onward into even more remote territory. They trekked through rugged country as Lassiter directed them based on his memory. One day, Lassiter returned to their camp jubilant, showing Johns a chunk of quartz veined with gold, proof, he claimed, that he'd rediscovered the rich reef. But he stubbornly refused to reveal the exact location, which only deepened Johns's suspicions. The two men fell into a heated argument and even came to blows. Finally, Johns, now convinced the reef was nothing but a fantasy, took the remaining camels and left Lassiter behind to fend for himself. Now completely alone with the exception of a couple of single-humped camels, Lassiter pushed onward on foot. Fate dealt one more cruel blow when his last two single-humpers bolted, carrying off most of his supplies. Stranded without food or water, he wandered the desert in dire straits until a group of nomadic Aboriginal people discovered him and shared what little they had. Their kindness kept Lassiter alive for several more weeks. During that time, according to entries later found in his diary, Lassiter claimed to have sighted the gold reef yet again, and even to have pegged a claim on it for his backers. But his physical condition was rapidly worsening, and he was nearly blind, malnourished, and unable to continue on. Harold Lassiter finally succumbed to starvation and exhaustion in late January 1931, alone in the vast emptiness of the interior. When Lassiter failed to return, his backers organized a search party. In March 1931, Bushman Bob Buck found Lassiter's remains near the border of Western Australia and the Northern Territory. Local Aboriginal people had given the dead man a rudimentary burial, laying his body in a shallow grave. This took some time for him to find, and to paraphrase Norm MacDonald, perhaps Buck could have shortened the search by hitting up all the shallow graves first. Buck duly reinterred Lassiter's remains, and later had them moved to a cemetery in Alice Springs. Nearby, Buck found a cave containing Lassiter's personal effects, including his journal and some letters. From these, the final pieces of the story emerged in Lassiter's own words. He described the camels running off, the assistance he received from indigenous companions, and his last futile trek toward civilization. Crucially, Lassiter's diary also asserted that he had indeed found the reef again, and had drawn a rough map to its location, which he hid in his kit bag under a sand dune. Years later, an expedition did dig up that buried kit bag, only to find the map inside had disintegrated to dust. With that, any final clue to the reef's location was lost to the elements. No firm evidence of Lassiter's reef was ever produced, yet the tale only grew in the telling. Over subsequent decades, it attained mythic status, perhaps the greatest lost mine legend in Australia. During the Depression era, the story of a hidden mountain of gold in the outback captured the public's imagination. Popular accounts of the saga made their way to print, and in these retellings the legend grew a bit each time. Some versions of the tale even claim that Lassiter didn't perish at the end, but that he actually ended up fleeing to America. In this version of events, he essentially realized the grift was up and got out, while the getting out was good. However, there's no evidence to prove this was the case, and everything seems to run against it. Harold Lassiter's life story reads more like that of a real-life Captain Ahab, rather than a grifter trying to make a buck. Despite the skeptics, the legend refuses to die, and the tantalizing possibility of a fortune in undiscovered gold continues to beckon adventurers into the desert even today. By some counts, at least a dozen full-on expeditions have tried, and failed, to locate Lassiter's reef over the years. Numerous lesser expeditions have also been carried out as well. Lassiter's own son, Bob, was among those who caught the gold bug fever. Bob Lassiter spent decades mounting some 30 searches of various sizes to redeem his father's name and secure that bag, or reef in this case. Reading Harold's diary had made him a firm believer that the reef was real. He believed his father had been betrayed by the expedition and never given a fair chance to reveal the reef's location. To his dying day, Bob maintained that his father had been telling the truth. The fact that his son was so dedicated to finding the reef as well has led many to believe that Harold was at worst delusional, but not a grifter like some have claimed. But to be fair, Bob Lassiter didn't acquire a case of intergenerational Captain Ahabism from dear old dad. Rather, he's a guy who just loved his dad and wanted the world to see that his father wasn't some sort of grifter. Today, nearly a century later, the mystery of Lassiter's Reef remains unsolved and as intriguing as ever. No one has confirmed the existence of Harold Lassiter's legendary gold, yet his name is firmly etched into Australia's outback lore. The cave where Lassiter sheltered in his final days now bears a plaque in his memory, and an incredibly desolate 150-mile highway, deep in the outback, bears his name. It began with a pounding on the walls one night. In early April 1921, the Bowen family's small cottage in Guyra, New South Wales, was suddenly under siege by an unseen assailant. Night after night, tremendous thumps rattled the walls, followed by showers of stones clattering onto the roof. Window after window shattered until nearly every pane of glass lay in shards. Nobody managed to catch sight of who, or what, was hurling the rocks, but the attacks seemed especially directed at 12-year-old Minnie Bowen. Stones smashed through Minnie's bedroom window with eerie precision, often landing right on her bed. The frightened family and their neighbors began to whisper that a spirit might be responsible. So began the legend of the Guyra ghost, a mystery that gripped the nation and still haunts Australian folklore. As the bizarre bombardment continued, the once quiet community of Guyra plunged into panic. Suspecting either a ghost or a crafty prowler, dozens of residents had witnessed the phantom stone throwing at the Bowen home and were on edge. Night after night, volunteer watch parties gathered, sometimes as many as 80 people, forming a human wall around the cottage. Their presence did seem to halt the rain of stones on evenings when the crowd stood guard. But to everyone's alarm, the thumping on the walls continued unabated. To those listening outside, the booming knocks sounded as if they came from within the house. To the Bowen family huddled indoors, the bangs seemed to originate just outside the walls. The blows were so powerful they nearly shook the house to its foundations. Fear and tension in Guyra escalated to a dangerous pitch, and most people believed this whole incident was caused by something even more sinister than a poltergeist. Many people began sleeping with loaded guns at the ready to blast any quote-unquote ghost back to the shadow realm, so to speak. This jittery vigilance led to a horrific tragedy. One night, a local woman kept a six-shooter under her pillow for protection, only for her young son to find it and accidentally shoot his sister, though luckily, the girl survived. Even the authorities were feeling the strain. The local police sergeant sat up night after night at the house, sitting amid the incessant disturbances. After days of fruitless stakeouts and sleepless stress, the sergeant finally snapped. He was sent away on leave, exhausted and convinced that something supernatural was at work. In response to the turmoil, the state government dispatched a team of detectives from Sydney to take over the case. The detectives maintained constant guard on the Bowen abode and continued coordinating the volunteer patrols. They even set up powerful floodlights to illuminate the area in hopes of catching the perpetrator. Yet even under these watchful conditions, the ghost, whatever it actually was, refused to be caught. On one occasion, with the yard brightly lit, two large stones struck a wall of the home right beside a policeman, yet no thrower was in sight. The mysterious siege of the Bowen home proved impossible to stop, and by mid-April the story had attracted international attention in the press. Reporters flocked to Guyra, and among the outsiders who arrived was H.J. Moores, an American businessman and friend of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, interested in psychic phenomena. Moores came equipped with cameras and traps, determined to sleuth out a rational explanation, or even better, find proof of a real poltergeist. He was given free rein to investigate the Bowen house. He even removed sections of the roof to create hidden lookout posts in the attic. But the resilient Gyra ghost outsmarted every trap. Pebbles and walnut-sized rocks continued to pepper the walls, and Moores couldn't tell if the projectiles were being thrown from outside or from within the house. After days of fruitless surveillance, Moores conceded that no human prankster was evident, and poltergeist activity was the only explanation he had left. With conventional methods failing, some turned to a spiritual approach. In mid-April, the Bowens invited a psychic, Ben Davy, to see if he could calm the unseen forces. Davy learned that Minnie had an older half-sister, May, who had died just 3 months before the disturbances began. Suspecting a connection, he gently urged Minnie to speak to the presence. Late one night, with Minnie's distraught mother and several officials looking on, Davy prompted the girl to ask the unseen knocker if it was her sister May. To everyone's astonishment, Minnie's timid question was answered by a loud knock from the darkness. Heartened, she continued the one-sided conversation. Before long, Minnie was in tears, claiming she heard May's voice. She related that her sister's spirit was happy in the afterlife, thanked their mother for her prayers, and promised to watch over the family. Strangely enough, after Minnie's emotional attempt to communicate with May, the nocturnal attacks ceased entirely, but only for a short time. For several days, the Bowen household enjoyed quiet, but just as they started to believe the nightmare was over, the phenomena started up again with renewed fury. In late April, as a last resort, Minnie was sent away to live with her grandmother in the town of Glen Innes, about 25 miles from Gyra. If Minnie was truly the focus of the mysterious force, the family hoped, removing her from Gyra would end the haunting. That theory backfired. The poltergeist followed Minnie to her grandmother's house. Almost as soon as she arrived in Glen Innes, the same telltale knocks and stone throwing began plaguing that household. A local police officer who stayed on guard there reported hearing stones pelting the roof and walls while he watched, yet seeing nothing but an empty yard outside. Inside, heavy thuds struck with incredible force. Wherever the hapless girl went, it seemed, the chaotic ghost went with her. After about a week in Glen Innes, Minnie returned home to Gyra. Gradually, the disturbances faded away in the weeks that followed. By early June, the strange siege of the Bowen homestead had ended. In the aftermath, the people of Gyra breathed a sigh of relief, but they were left scratching their heads. Many residents were eager to put the bizarre episode behind them. In later years, locals often downplayed the story or offered far-fetched rationalizations. One local claim was that the stones had all been fired by a giant slingshot from a far-off hill, a theory that never fit the facts but allowed skeptics to laugh the whole thing off. Sometimes the quote-unquote rational theory can make the supernatural theories look totally normal and commonplace, I suppose. Meanwhile, the police were also keen to close the book on the Gyra affair. Under pressure from detectives, Minnie Bowen confessed that on a few occasions she had tossed small stones onto the roof and tapped on a wall to scare a relative. However, she denied responsibility for the vast majority of incidents, and her family never wavered in asserting her innocence. No accomplice was ever identified, and if a real human trickster had been terrorizing the Bowens, that person was never caught. The police declared the mystery solved as a hoax, but plenty of people remained unconvinced. Paranormal researchers, unsurprisingly, had a different view. They noted that the events bore all the classic hallmarks of a poltergeist: a noisy spirit, known for tossing objects about and banging walls, typically centered around an adolescent. In their eyes, young Minnie fit the profile of a classic poltergeist focus, a girl on the cusp of puberty unwittingly acting as the catalyst for the chaos. One investigator who studied the case concluded that the Gyra haunting was likely real, with Minnie herself the unwitting source of strange events. The incident's notoriety even inspired a silent film that same year, The Gyra Ghost Mystery, which actually featured Minnie and the rest of the family playing themselves. Weirdly, this film wasn't an early example of the horror genre as you might expect. We don't know exactly what was in the film, since all that survives is the script and some promotional material, but it was actually a comedy, or billed as such at least. This has led some to speculate that the entire family was in on the charade and had done it to gain notoriety and perhaps cash out, while the cashing out was good. Also, just as a quick aside, the brilliant paranormal investigator in the Gyra Ghost Mystery is named Sherlock Doyle. Now, I'm sure I don't have to spell it out for you guys, but Sherlock Holmes was created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Personally, Sherlock Doyle sounds like someone who would hunt down Arsène Lupin, the gentleman thief, on days when Sherlock Holmes is on vacation. Anyway, putting that aside, if the plan was to parlay a poltergeist hoax into silver screen fame, this didn't work out so well for the Bowen family. The movie was seen by almost no one at the time, and as I mentioned, it was subsequently lost and forgotten. In the dense rainforests of Borneo, tales persist of a secretive striped predator lurking just out of sight. Locals speak in hushed tones of the harimau, a tiger said to stalk the jungles. This isn't some cryptozoological entity cobbled together in modern times, far from it. The harimau is the Borneo tiger, a creature which definitely once existed, and which the locals have great reverence for. Officially, tigers have never been documented in Borneo's modern history. The only wild tigers in Indonesia roam Sumatra today, with extinct subspecies formerly in Java and Bali. Yet on Borneo, indigenous Dayak communities hold memories and rituals invoking a great striped cat, passing down legends that keep the mystery alive. Could a tiger truly prowl this island's dense jungles? Or are the contemporary reports based upon long-held cultural memories? To understand the enigma, we first need to consider Borneo's place in Sundaland, the biogeographic grouping of Southeast Asian islands that were once connected. During the Ice Age, lowered sea levels linked Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and the Asian mainland into one landmass, allowing animals to disperse freely. Tigers did populate many parts of this realm. The Indonesian islands of Java and Bali had their own tigers until last century, and Sumatra still has a fragile tiger population today. Borneo, however, seems to be the puzzling exception. The island harbors other large mammals also found in Sumatra: elephants, orangutans, leopards, and rhinos, but no tigers. Clues from the deep past suggest that tigers were indeed part of Borneo's ancient ecosystem. In the mid-20th century, archaeologists excavating Naya Cave in Sarawak uncovered hundreds of thousands of animal bone fragments. Among them was a tiger's wrist bone from a young tiger. Modern dating later revealed this bone to be roughly 13,000 years old. More recent digs have yielded additional evidence. In 2021, scientists reported a partial tiger jaw from another cave, dated to about 22,000 years ago. These fossils confirm that the tiger prowled Bornean forests in the late Pleistocene. However, concrete evidence of any Bornean tiger beyond prehistoric times remains elusive. No tiger remains from the last few thousand years have been conclusively identified, and early European naturalists and explorers never documented live tigers on the island. This lack of historical record suggests that if tigers did linger into the time of human settlement, they disappeared by the time written history and scientific surveys began. Notably, this is somewhat complicated by the fact that the kingdoms and empires that dominated what is now Indonesia prior to the arrival of Europeans were primarily maritime empires. They all knew about tigers and employed tiger imagery, though it's unclear if these were Borneo tigers. The cause of their disappearance is unknown, but what's clear is that by the modern era, tigers were officially absent from Borneo's fauna. Despite the biological blank space, the indigenous peoples of Borneo have rich oral histories and cultural practices involving tigers. Among Dayak communities, the tiger holds a prominent place in folklore, spirituality, and even language. The word for this specific tiger exists in numerous local dialects, such as Haramaung in Dayak, and traditional belief systems include Borneo tiger-associated myths. And just to drive the point home, the word Haramaung is different from the generalized word for tiger. There's also talk of a creature called Remaung, which is essentially a tiger spirit. Elders would say it was a kind of were-tiger, a spiritual being taking the form of a great cat, which made sense in ancient times when tigers were believed to roam the land. Physical tokens deriving from quote-unquote tiger loot drops are also woven into Dayak traditions. Heirloom artifacts, passed down through generations, sometimes include tiger parts. In one account, a Dayak leader proudly displayed an heirloom sword, decorated with what he asserted were tiger fangs. According to this account, these were orange drops from beasts slain by his ancestors in the Borneo jungles. Over the years, a few other tantalizing claims have surfaced to suggest the Borneo tiger might not be entirely myth. One famous account comes from 1975, when a Belgian adventurer led an expedition into East Kalimantan. The adventurer later claimed he encountered a tiger in the Bornean jungle and even managed to snap 2 photographs as evidence. The grainy photos, when published, appeared to show a tiger according to secondary accounts. And I say secondary accounts here because it doesn't appear that these photographs have ever been published online. That said, all sources agree that this was indeed a tiger, though it was questionable whether the photograph was actually taken in Borneo. From the scientific perspective, the consensus is clear. There is no hard evidence that any tigers live in Borneo today. No skins, no verified tracks, no droppings, no roadkill, no genetic traces, nothing. Biologists claim that if a breeding population of tigers had survived into the present, some tangible sign would likely have turned up by now. The skeptics argue that what locals call a tiger is likely a case of mistaken identity or memory, perhaps conflating the clouded leopard with a true tiger. Notably, these Dayak people have come to view this claim as quite offensive, since their indigenous religious and cultural traditions very clearly refer to tigers. As evidence for this, they and their supporters point out that the clouded leopard also has a role in their traditions, and this role is clearly separate from that of the Borneo tiger. They also casually observe that clouded leopards are relatively small, cute animals with spots, not large, ferocious, striped animals. They further assert that they and their ancestors are and were indeed able to tell the difference between a stripe and a spot. Notably, biologists also puzzle over why Borneo lacks tigers if they once had them. Habitat alone doesn't explain it, as Borneo's dense jungles and ample prey resemble Sumatra's, which supports tigers, and they were all part of one land mass. One hypothesis is that early human hunters or habitat changes thousands of years ago eliminated Borneo's tigers. Yet, intriguingly, some very legitimate researchers urge that we keep an open mind to local knowledge. They point out that Western scientists historically overlooked indigenous reports at times, and sometimes to their detriment. Given the elusive nature of tigers, and given that a small population may be viable, some experts believe that this tiger may be more reality than myth. John Dillinger was an American gangster who became a household name during the Great Depression. Between June 1933 and July 1934, Dillinger and his gang terrorized the Midwest, robbing banks and police armories, staging jailbreaks, and engaging in shootouts. He was implicated in at least 10 slayings and multiple injuries to law enforcement officers. Dillinger's headline-grabbing heists transformed him into a notorious folk figure. In response to public fascination and his escalating crimes, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover named Dillinger Public Enemy Number 1, making the outlaw a priority target for federal agents. By mid-1934, Dillinger was America's most wanted criminal, his exploits romanticized in newspapers, even as authorities closed in on him. According to official records, John Dillinger met his end on July 22, 1934, outside Chicago's Biograph Theater. That evening, Dillinger went to see the gangster film Manhattan Melodrama with two women, Polly Hamilton, his girlfriend at the time, and Anna Sage. Unbeknownst to Dillinger, Anna Sage had secretly alerted law enforcement to his whereabouts. Sage had arranged to lead Dillinger into a trap and point him out to agents in hopes of collecting a $5,000 reward. This was the equivalent of over $100,000 today, which, all things considered, seems fairly low for the risks involved in taking out a high-profile organized crime figure. Local police and FBI agents under Agent Melvin Purvis set up an ambush outside the theater. Around 10:30 p.m., as Dillinger exited the Biograph with the two women, Purvis signaled the attack by lighting a cigar. Dillinger sensed the trap and attempted to flee, reportedly reaching for a pistol in his pocket, at least according to the official narrative. In response, a group of agents opened fire, pumping Dillinger full of lead. Dillinger collapsed to the pavement, and he was quickly taken to a nearby hospital, where he was pronounced dead at around 11 that evening. Notably, throngs of curious onlookers gathered to glimpse Dillinger's corpse, with some dipping handkerchiefs in his blood as morbid souvenirs. The body was publicly identified as John Dillinger and was put on display for a time, in part to convince a fascinated public that the outlaw was truly dead. He was buried in Crown Hill Cemetery in his hometown of Indianapolis. Fearing grave robbers and relic hunters, Dillinger's family later had his coffin reinterred under a protective cap of concrete and iron, topped by heavy concrete slabs. This unusual step likely wasn't a bad idea, considering that people were willing to soak up his blood at the scene where he was shot down. By all official accounts, the story seemed closed. John Dillinger was dead and buried in 1934, and the FBI's top gangland nemesis was no more. Almost immediately after Dillinger's shooting, whispers began to circulate that the FBI might have gotten the wrong man. Such theories often spring up around larger-than-life figures, much as rumors later claimed that Elvis Presley or Michael Jackson had faked their deaths. In Dillinger's case, a number of odd discrepancies and inconsistencies were noted in the aftermath of the shooting. These fueled speculation that the man killed at the Biograph Theater was not John Dillinger at all. One of the first puzzling details was the corpse's eye color. Contemporary morgue records from 1934 listed the dead man's eyes as brown, yet Dillinger was known to have had gray-blue eyes. This discrepancy was highlighted in a Cook County coroner's report rediscovered decades later. Medical experts cautioned that eye color can appear clouded or darker after death. There were other physical mismatches as well. The body in the morgue had none of Dillinger's well-documented scars or past bullet wound marks, according to accounts of the autopsy. Dillinger, who was 31, had been injured several times during his criminal career, and even underwent clandestine plastic surgery while on the run in an attempt to alter his appearance. Yet the autopsy report supposedly noted no signs of recent facial surgery on the body. Notably, The corpse was also said to have fingerprints, despite Dillinger allegedly having physically removed his own fingerprints with acid. Theorists argue that if Dillinger had truly undergone facial alteration and tried to remove his fingerprints, the lack of surgical scars and the intact prints on the body make little sense. That is, unless it was someone else's body entirely. Perhaps most striking, the autopsy noted that the dead man suffered from a chronic heart condition that had scarred his heart since childhood. Dillinger, however, was by all accounts a very healthy fellow, having played semi-pro baseball, and was known for athletic feats during robberies and prison breaks. A person with advanced heart disease would likely have been severely limited, which didn't match Dillinger's lifestyle. This detail of a bad heart in the corpse raised eyebrows. Additionally, some witnesses remarked that the body appeared shorter and heavier than Dillinger's known build. Even Dillinger's facial features, such as the shape of the ears and the front teeth, were reported to differ from known photos of the outlaw. Such claims, though anecdotal, bolstered the idea that something was off in the official story. At the time, law enforcement attributed any minor differences to Dillinger's attempts at disguise. The FBI pointed out that Dillinger had grown a mustache, dyed his hair, and undergone plastic surgery to remove identifying moles and scars, which could account for a changed appearance. They also emphasized that fingerprints taken from the body matched Dillinger's fingerprints on record, seemingly settling the matter. According to the FBI, agents at the scene obtained 2 sets of prints from the corpse, which both positively identified Dillinger. They also confirmed a 3rd matching set was taken during the official autopsy. The FBI discounted the idea that Dillinger had ever removed his fingerprints, suggesting that this was part of the myth-making surrounding this outlaw. These forensic matches, in the Bureau's view, were definitive proof that the correct man was killed. However, skeptics have long alleged that this fingerprint evidence might have been falsified or mishandled. The reason for this, according to theorists, is that the FBI blasted a Dillinger look-alike and then planted evidence to save face. Effectively, they needed to cover up blasting a doppelganger down on the streets of Chicago. According to this theory, Dillinger, realizing that the FBI had taken the bait either intentionally or to save face, decided it was a good time to quit his life of crime. Other rumors and anecdotal reports have added to the legend. In the years following 1934, there were occasional claims of Dillinger sightings around the country, as often happens with infamous figures whose deaths some refuse to believe. It was said, for instance, that Dillinger's sister suddenly began taking trips to California in the late 1930s, sparking talk that she was secretly visiting her fugitive brother. Some members of Dillinger's own family long harbored doubts about the body, believing it wasn't really him. In fact, when Dillinger's father first viewed the corpse in Chicago, he reportedly blurted that it did not look like his son. He noticed unfamiliar features like differently shaped eyes and a changed physique, according to later retellings. However, according to the official narrative, this is because Dillinger had deliberately undergone plastic surgery to alter his appearance. Further, skeptics note that bodies and facial features change rapidly post-mortem, which combined with the surgery could have resulted in him looking entirely different. For mainstream historians and the FBI, John Dillinger's fate has never truly been in question. The consensus is that Dillinger died that night in Chicago, and the survival theories are viewed as far-fetched urban legends surrounding this larger-than-life bandit. And of course, it's necessary to note that Dillinger is one of the most notorious criminals in American history. Much like Billy the Kid or Butch Cassidy or any other famous outlaw, the stories about him have just continued to grow in the last century or so. Notably, Dillinger still has numerous living relatives, and in 2019, They attempted to literally dig up the past and run DNA tests to confirm things once and for all. However, this was stopped when another faction of the Dillinger family went ahead and started a legal dispute to stop the exhumation process. Apparently, those Dillingers sure are a contentious bunch, even to this day. In the end, whether John Dillinger truly died on that Chicago street or lived on under an alias may never be conclusively proven, barring DNA testing. In the early 20th century, Chicago's underworld had an undisputed king in Big Jim Colosimo. Born Vincenzo Colosimo in 1878 in Italy, he came to Chicago as a teenager and rose from shoe shiner and petty thief to the city's foremost vice lord. By the 1900s, Big Jim, also known as Diamond Jim for his love of flashy jewelry, controlled a thriving criminal empire. He married a prominent madam in 1902 and befriended local corrupt politicians. Backed by these corrupt city officials, Big Jim consolidated the city's vice operations into a lucrative racket. In doing so, he effectively laid the foundation for what would later be known as the Chicago Outfit. Big Jimmy's power and popularity were notable, and he very clearly wasn't your typical shady underworld figure who attempted to keep a low profile. Big Jim was, to put it simply, a man of big appetites. He was a jovial, outgoing figure who reveled in his success, earning him the Big Jim moniker as much for his personality as for his stature. By the 1910s, he owned the opulent Colosimo's Cafe on South Wabash Avenue, a nightclub where Chicago's high society rubbed shoulders with underworld figures. Celebrities and politicians alike dined at Colosimo's establishment, underscoring the influence he wielded in both crime and city politics. That said, with Chicago politics at the time, there wasn't too much difference between the two regardless. To guard his growing empire, Big Jim brought in his relative by marriage, Johnny Torrio, from New York in 1909. By 1920, Colosimo had spent nearly 2 decades at the top of Chicago's vice world, seemingly untouchable as the city's crime boss. However, the fact that Big Jim isn't a household name, while Al Capone is one of the most famous gangsters in history, should tell you that Jim wouldn't be around for much longer. The enactment of Prohibition in January 1920 presented a new illicit opportunity: bootlegging booze. Torrio urged Big Jim to capitalize on this lucrative trade, but Colosimo balked. He was content with his thriving underground businesses and feared that large-scale bootlegging would draw unwanted federal attention. Big Jimmy may have had every corrupt Chicago politician in his pocket, but the same couldn't be said for the feds. At the same time, Colosimo's personal life was in flux. He divorced Victoria Moresco, who was also Torrio's aunt, in early 1920, and quickly married a young singer, Dale Winter, in April of that year. This combination of a personal split and a business disagreement with Torrio may have proven to be fateful. Colosimo's reluctance to embrace the new bootleg liquor racket left his ambitious lieutenant increasingly frustrated, and his sudden divorce and marriage upset old alliances. The stage was set for a violent change at the top, and as they say, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. On May 11th, 1920, just weeks after his wedding, Big Jim arrived at his lavish restaurant expecting a business meeting that he would never leave alive. That afternoon, Colosimo had phoned his new bride to say he'd be late for dinner because he had an important meeting with an unknown man at his restaurant. The cafe was closed between meal services with only a few staff on site when Big Jimmy swaggered in looking for his appointment. He asked a waiter if anyone had been by, and hearing no, Big Jim went to his office to wait. The ambiance was eerily quiet. No patrons, just the clink of dishes in the kitchen and the shuffle of employees preparing for meal service that evening. After a short while with no sign of his expected guest, Colosimo grew uneasy and stepped out of his office into the lobby. At that very moment, an assailant was lying in wait. As Colosimo peered through a door toward the street, perhaps looking for a visitor, a figure crept up from behind. A sudden shot cracked through the empty restaurant. Big Jim was struck in the back of the head, hitting the base of his skull. He collapsed instantly, sprawled on the marble floor of his own upscale cafe. The perpetrator had timed the attack perfectly. Colosimo was alone and unguarded in that brief moment. In the aftermath, the shooter slipped out into the afternoon light, vanishing before anyone could stop him. The slaying of such a prominent mob boss sparked immediate theories, and Chicago's rumor mill went into overdrive. The press originally attempted to tie it all to his controversial divorce and remarriage, suggesting his ex-wife wanted Jimmy cut down to size. While this may have sold papers, there was simply no evidence for it, and other more plausible theories began to emerge. Besides the jilted ex-wife angle, another early theory pointed to the Black Hand, a shadowy network of Southern Italian extortionists. In establishing the Chicago outfit, Big Jim and his boys had ended up piling up members of this loosely organized group into Chicago gutters. Some speculated that those old vendettas had finally caught up to him in 1920, and the authorities knew he was a marked man in these circles. However, these Black Hand groups were already in massive decline by 1920, and no evidence tied these groups to the attack. These accusations helped deflect attention from what would soon emerge as the most likely scenario, an inside job from within Colosimo's own outfit. Scrutinizing who stood to gain from Big Jim's demise led investigators and informed observers to focus on Johnny Torrio, Colosimo's trusted underboss. Torrio had been loyally running Colosimo's operations and protecting him for years, yet he also had the ambition and foresight that Big Jim increasingly lacked. With prohibition in effect, Torrio was eager to dive into bootlegging and rack up fortunes as a booze baron, but Colosimo's stubborn refusal was an obstacle. Eliminating Colosimo cleared the way for Torrio to take over and transform the organization, and almost immediately after the slaying, Torrio's behavior raised eyebrows. He took charge of the situation with remarkable poise and organized an extravagant funeral for Big Jim, all while beginning to exercise power in his own right. To many observers, it looked as though the old lion had been felled by an up-and-comer, and the pride was now firmly under the control of Johnny and a new generation of mobsters. Or, in this analogy, new generation of lions. But hey, it sounded kind of silly when I read it aloud. The most widely accepted theory is that Johnny Torrio ordered the hit on Big Jim. According to this theory, Torrio privately arranged for a trusted hitman from New York to do the job, keeping his own hands as clean as possible in the circumstances. Torrio had connections to the New York underworld from his earlier days, notably his friendship with Frankie Yale, a notorious Brooklyn mobster. In the spring of 1920, Torrio supposedly reached out to Yale for help eliminating Big Jim, knowing that an out-of-town professional would arouse less suspicion among Chicago police. By some accounts, Torrio even convened a meeting with New York gang leaders to get their blessing for him to become Chicago's new boss, once Colosimo was gone. Another name inevitably surfaced in the rumor mill: Al Capone. Capone was a young protege of Torrio, who had recently arrived from New York to help with Colosimo's enterprises. Later legends accused Capone of very direct involvement in the whacking of Big Jim, with some even claiming that Al Capone himself was the trigger man. However, most historians find this unlikely, as Capone was still an up-and-comer at the time and may not have been trusted with such a big job. Further, it remains an open question if Capone was even in Chicago on the day in question. It's more plausible that Capone's role was to help Torrio consolidate power after Big Jim was gone, rather than to execute the hit himself. Ultimately, whether or not Capone had any direct hand in the attack, he unquestionably benefited from it. The slaying of Big Jim removed the old guard and opened the door for Torrio and Capone's generation to take over Chicago. And the rest, as they say, is history. While the whodunit was never proven in court, the Torrio-Yale theory remains the most compelling and widely accepted. That said, Big Jim spent his life running up untrustworthy friends and bitter foes in equal measure, so the question can never be answered with complete certainty. In the winter of 1946, a quiet New England town became the center of a baffling mystery. 18-year-old Paula Weldon, a sophomore at Bennington College in Vermont, set off for an afternoon hike and was never seen again. Her sudden vanishing on December 1st, 1946, sparked one of the largest searches in Vermont's history. Paula Weldon was, by all accounts, an intelligent and friendly young woman. She was the eldest of 4 daughters of an accomplished engineer from Stamford, Connecticut, and had a promising future ahead of her. At Bennington College, Paula was known for her artistic interests and had recently developed a passion for gardening and plant life. Despite this outwardly bright disposition, those close to Paula noted that she had been feeling a bit blue in the days leading up to her disappearance. In fact, she had opted not to go home for Thanksgiving just a week earlier, after a disagreement with her father. The two had argued about a young man Paula had been seeing, a boyfriend who her father disapproved of. This tension, coupled with Paula's subdued mood, would later feed into various theories about what might have happened to her. But on that first Sunday of December, 1946, nothing seemed amiss, as Paula decided to take a study break and get some fresh air. That Sunday, Paula worked an early shift in the campus dining hall, then returned to her dormitory on campus in the early afternoon. Around 2:45 p.m., she told her roommate, Elizabeth Johnson, that she was taking a study break and going for a long walk. She didn't specify exactly where she was headed, but being a mild day for early December, a hike in the surrounding woods seemed plausible. She didn't take any spare clothes or gear for a long trip. No backpack, no money, no overnight provisions, indicating she expected to be back within a few hours. Wearing a red coat in the woods might normally make someone more visible, yet that striking red jacket would soon become a haunting detail in her story. Eyewitness accounts later helped piece together Paula's movements that afternoon. Leaving campus, Paula walked down the long college driveway to the main road and began hitchhiking toward the trailheads outside of town. A driver, a local contractor heading east on Route 9, picked up a young woman matching Paula's description near the Bennington campus entrance. He led her out near Woodford Hollow, close to the start of the Long Trail, a popular long-distance hiking trail that cuts through the Green Mountains. Interestingly, the distinctive red jacket stuck out to the driver. From there, Paula continued on foot. Several people reported seeing a girl in a red coat along the road and at the trail entrance. One group of hikers later recalled crossing paths with Paula as they were coming down the trail, and she was going up. Again, she stood out because she was wearing her very distinctive red coat. They remembered her asking for directions about the long trail and how to follow it north toward Glastonbury Mountain. These hikers, aware that dusk was approaching, had cautioned Paula that the day was ending, and she wasn't dressed for an extended hike in the coming cold. Paula nevertheless pressed on up the trail alone. As daylight faded on that quiet woodland path, she was observed walking northward near an area known as Harbor Road. That was the last confirmed sighting of Paula Weldon. She headed into the woods as the sun went down and the darkness of a December night closed in. And somehow, in that brief span of time, Paula vanished. When Paula failed to return to campus that night, it didn't immediately raise alarm. Students often studied late or stayed with friends. Her roommate assumed Paula might be cramming at the library or had spontaneously gone to visit someone. But by the next morning, on Monday, Paula still hadn't returned, which was deeply out of character. Concern quickly mounted, and the college administration was notified, and they in turn alerted local authorities. The search for Paula Weldon rapidly became a massive operation. Bennington College suspended classes so that students and faculty could help scour the campus and surrounding areas. Police from nearby areas, firefighters, and hundreds of local volunteers joined the effort. The Vermont National Guard even dispatched troops to assist in combing the wilderness. The search parties concentrated on the Long Trail area where Paula had been seen. They trudged through woods, waded across streams, and poked into every area they could find. Plans were made for aerial searches, and small planes flew over the forested hills, looking for any bright red dot that might be Paula's coat. The weather had turned frigid, and at night a dusting of snow covered the ground, complicating the effort. Despite the manpower and the urgent determination, no trace of Paula was found. Not a shoe print, not a shred of cloth. It was as if she had stepped off the trail and simply disappeared into thin air. News of the missing Bennington College sophomore spread quickly, capturing regional attention. The Bennington Banner newspaper printed Paula's photograph, which helped jog the memories of witnesses who came forward to say they had seen her on Sunday. Tips and alleged sightings started pouring in from all over New England. People in Vermont, New York, and Massachusetts reported catching glimpses of young women who resembled Paula. At one point, a waitress in Fall River, Massachusetts, claimed she had served an upset-looking girl fitting Paula's description the day after the disappearance. For Paula's anxious father, this tip offered a glimmer of hope. He personally traveled to Fall River to investigate. Unfortunately, that lead, like so many others, turned out to lead nowhere. Not long after, a train conductor in South Carolina reported a sighting of a woman who could have been Paula on board his train, but this too led nowhere. Days turned into weeks, and the promising leads dwindled one by one, each dead end deepening the mystery. As the field searches failed to produce results, the investigation shifted into other gears. Recognizing that Vermont at the time lacked a dedicated state police force, Paula's father, William Weldon, grew frustrated with the local sheriff's efforts. He openly criticized the lack of organization and resources. Indeed, it later emerged that in the critical first days of the search, the local sheriffs hadn't even kept proper written records of the investigation. This was a shocking lapse that could have allowed important clues to slip away. Desperate for more expertise, Paula's father used his influence to persuade the Vermont governor to request outside help. Law enforcement officers from New York, Massachusetts, and Paula's home state of Connecticut arrived to assist. The FBI was also consulted due to the possibility that Paula could have been kidnapped and taken across state lines, though no evidence of that ever surfaced. With bolstered ranks, investigators started re-interviewing everyone who had been near the Long Trail that day. They knocked on doors of every house along the route Paula was known to have taken. One name soon emerged as a possible lead: Fred Gaudette, a local lumberjack who lived in a cabin along Harbor Road near the trail. Gaudette was reportedly one of the last people who might have crossed paths with Paula. On that Sunday, he had been at his cabin in the midst of a heated argument with his girlfriend. In a rage, Gaudette stormed out of the house around the same time Paula would have been passing by. Initially, he told police he went straight to his shack and spent the evening alone. At other times, he claimed he had driven up the trail in his truck after their argument. These conflicting accounts made detectives suspicious that he might be hiding something. In fact, over the ensuing weeks and even years, he would change his story multiple times. On one occasion, he even boasted drunkenly to acquaintances that he knew where Paula's body was buried. However, when pressed by police in later interviews, Gaudette recanted and said he made it up for attention. Investigators found no hard evidence linking the lumberjack to Paula's disappearance. No body, no sign of a struggle, nothing. Without evidence of a crime, Gaudette remained only a person of interest and never was formally charged. His involvement, if any, remains an unsettled question, but many who have studied the case continue to view him with suspicion given his inconsistent statements. With no breakthroughs in the case, the ground search eventually wound down after several weeks. By mid-December 1946, many volunteers had gone home, and snow had blanketed the Green Mountains, making further searching futile until spring. Paula's father, exhausted and heartsick, left Vermont around December 16th to return to Connecticut, bitterly disappointed at not finding his daughter. Small-scale searches would continue into January, and when the snows melted the following spring, teams once again ventured onto the Long Trail again, hoping to find a clue, but in vain. Early on, many who knew Paula feared she had simply gotten lost or injured on the trail. Perhaps she had strayed from the path, fallen into a ravine or hidden crevice, or succumbed to the cold when night fell. It's true that December nights in Vermont can be unforgiving. Temperatures can drop well below freezing. Dressed lightly and caught in darkness, Paula could have become disoriented, maybe suffering hypothermia. If she had gotten hurt or lost, one would expect searchers to eventually find a trace. Yet the complete lack of any physical evidence lent doubt to the simple lost hiker theory. The most unsettling theory, and the one that law enforcement often leans toward in such cases, is foul play. Perhaps Paula encountered the wrong person in the woods that day. If someone harmed Paula, it could explain why no trace of her was found. The remote Long Trail area, with its dense woods and abandoned old logging roads, could conceal a crime. While Fred Gaudette is a prime suspect, some have proposed the idea of a possible serial predator. In a 5-year span from 1945 to 1950, 5 people vanished in the same Vermont wilderness without a trace. This chilling potential pattern would later inspire local lore about the so-called Bennington Triangle, a place where some eerie force or unknown serial perpetrator might be at work. Meanwhile, Paula's family had to carry on without answers. Eventually, Paula was declared legally dead in absentia, but not until years later, when hope of her return had faded and legal matters had to be settled. Today, nearly 80 years later, the disappearance of Paula Weldon remains open in the Vermont State Police files, officially unsolved.